Welcome everybody back. Welcome to day 2 of Clean Water Fest, and we are very glad to have you here. Day 2 is going to be like nothing you've seen before. We're excited to have you here. My name is John Gonzalez, John G at NEORSD, and we are very glad to have you back for the second broadcast of the week. Yesterday was a big day, a lot going on here in the Cleveland area. We'll talk a little bit about that here on a little bit later in our broadcast today. But yesterday was a great debut for the series. We are looking forward to the rest of the week, including today. We're going to take you for a Tours Tuesday. Looking forward very much to sharing some of our expertise and our experts with you, and being able to bring you some new insight about the work that goes on here that you may never see for Clean Water Fest this year, new and improved, virtual, all online. So yesterday we got a chance to take a look at the urban water cycle. Jessica and Ebony walked you through what that process looks like. Our CEO, Kyle Dreyfus-Wells, had a chance to bring you some of that information. And so today we're going to take you on a tour of 2 of our biggest facilities and most notable facilities that are very popular on our Clean Water Fest tours of years gone by. And so that is our Southerly Wastewater Treatment Plant and our laboratory. If you're tuned in on Facebook, if you're tuned in on our YouTube channel, we are glad to have you here. Give us a comment. Let us know what you're watching. And if you are watching us on our cleanwaterfest.com website, we also are glad to have you there and look forward to sharing this content moving forward this week. A couple of things I want you to keep in mind as we debut one of our first video segments for today's broadcast. We definitely want you to pay attention to a couple different things. First of all, when you take a look at our Southerly Treatment Plant, we're going to debut that video first. Our Southerly Treatment Plant is one of the largest of its kind in the country, and we are very excited to be able to share that story and share the videos and the faces that are behind the scenes there at our Southerly plant. And our lab is award-winning, state certified. It's a big deal, and we are glad to bring you some of the people who are doing the work in the lab on the science side of things to make sure that the water is being treated properly at our facilities. As you're watching these videos and later hearing from our experts, I want you to think about 2 things, 2 realities, the size and also the smells. Why am I telling you to think of those things? Because if you were here in person, both of those things will be very visible to you. You'll be able to have an idea of how large these facilities are, how large these processes are, and how many people are behind the scenes making this work happen. So the size is impressive, and we're hoping to convey some of that in these couple brief video clips and interviews we're going to share with you here soon. The other aspect is the smells. You might assume that a wastewater treatment facility has odors to it, and the reality is it does. And no matter where you are in the facility, if you're on a plant tour, the smells change from process to process, and it's something very interesting. We also hope that the video can convey a sense of, it can appeal to your senses of all kinds. We can't share the smells with you here over a streaming service, but we do hope you can kind of visualize what might be going on in these processes. And some of our experts will be able to speak to that. We'll be speaking to Brian Poswick and Kelly Balick. They'll give you some of their perspective and their insight as to what's going on in the processes that we're going to look at here in the video. Following our Southerly tour, we're going to take you through our lab. And again, the size and the smells of the lab are going to surprise you. And we'll be able to have Cheryl Soltis-Muth telling us a little bit about that work and what goes on in our laboratory day after day. So we're looking forward to sharing these with you. I am going to start our video feature for today, which is our Southerly Wastewater Treatment Plant tour. We do hope you enjoy it. And we are looking forward to not only this segment, but the interview that will follow with Brian and Kelly here momentarily. So stay tuned.
Hi everyone, my name is Terry Robinson. I'm the superintendent here at the Southerly Wastewater Treatment Center. And the Southerly Wastewater Treatment Center was built in 1927.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Rojas here at Southerly Wastewater Treatment Center. So this is where the water enters the wastewater treatment plant. Okay. This machine behind me captures all the large debris and dumps it on the conveyor belt. The conveyor belt carries the large debris into the dumpsters, which are then hauled away for landfill. Here we have our aerated grit tanks where air is introduced into the water, causing all the heavy grit to fall to the bottom of the tank. We get all the rock, sand, weathered pavement out of the wastewater. It falls to the bottom.
And then it gravities the whole way across. Goes through the aeration tanks. And then we have a series of bays where it settles. The solids settle to the bottom, and the clear water goes out the weirs and then down to the filters and then the outfall. Sludge is part of the biomass that treats the water. You can see how it blends the polymer with the solids. The solids coagulate and separate from the water. And we remove a portion of that every day and keep the process moving. So we're pulling out the old sludge and we're letting the new sludge treat the water so we have a better water quality leaving the plant. These are our incineration units here. We're not going to be able to see them all because they're really tall and they go down to the basement. They're lined with brick.
This is southerly's outfall. It normally takes about 24 to 26 hours to get to this final process. The outfall is the last process of our effluent from the plant, which is the clean water going from our plant to the Cuyahoga River, which is 10 river miles away from Lake Erie.
I want to thank everybody for being patient with us as we were working through some of those technical issues. For those of you who are watching, I did have a reason to be bobbing my head along with that music. And so I'm very glad and fortunate to be joined by a couple of our experts here. Brian and Kelly are going to be joining us on camera here momentarily. But what they're going to be doing is giving us a little bit of insight in terms of what you just saw in that video. There's a lot we could cover. At the very end, we heard that the process itself takes anywhere from 24 hours and sometimes more for the water to work its way through the treatment process and through the treatment plant. And it can be very difficult to really comprehend how significant that time frame is and the amount of work that goes behind the scenes and being able to make sure that water is treated safely. So Brian and Kelly each bring a different area of expertise along with us and along with them to give us a bit more insight about what's going on and the areas of expertise behind the scenes. Brian and Kelly, can you join us here? Kelly, thank you. Brian, good to have you. I'm glad both of you were able to join us here. Your sound's okay for both of you?
Yeah.
Very good. I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Brian and Kelly, why don't you both, if you don't mind, introduce yourself and just give us a little bit of information about how you got to the career path you're in right now. Kelly, you are a unit process manager. Tell us a bit about that work and how you got to that role you have here at the district.
Yes, I'm a unit process manager at Southerly. So I oversee the front end of the plant. So the grit tanks, like you saw in the video, the primary settling tanks, we have a high rate treatment when we have wet weather events. So that's all my unit. I started at the district as a co-op in our environmental compliance group as an environmental science major at CSU, and just fell in love with the district and what we do here and the service that we do provide for the community. And it just led my career path.
I like to hear that. I'm a fellow co-op as well, who started my career here after a short stint as a co-op, and it's been a great opportunity for me. Brian, tell us a bit about your work. You're on the electrical and instrumentation side. What does that entail, and what brought you to the district?
Yeah, well, I started over 18 years ago here. I came in as a electrical instrument tech at the Westerly facility, the smallest of the 3 facilities here. Spent some time there, then I came over to Southerly as an instrument tech. Spent some time, then I went into our automation department for, 13 plus years, where I traveled throughout all the facilities, over the 400 square miles that Southerly and Easterly, Westerly, the collection system all take care of the 60-some communities out there. Then I came in here as manager, instrumentation, electrical for Southerly. The plant's so big, it's kind of broken into 2 kind of streams, the wet and the dry side of it. There's over 3,000 instruments here that run the process with hundreds of computers and a number of processes. So very complex, but very unique, very good. We do amazing things here every day, and we don't strive to not make them even better out there.
So let me say 2 things about that. As I introduce the lab segment we're going to see here shortly, I mentioned that our lab is award-winning. Our treatment plants are all award-winning as well. And the level of performance that our treatment plants have is a testament to the employees such as yourself and the many that go unseen every day to keep things running and to make sure that our processes are doing what they need to do to protect public health and the environment. So both of you have insights about our other facilities. Southerly is not our only treatment plant, as you mentioned. We do have 2 other facilities, our Easterly and Westerly plant as well. What can you say about how these plants compare? What do they have in common? Where do they differ? How do those 3 plants all work together in the treatment process?
Well, Southerly is definitely the largest plant. We do have a 2-stage activated sludge process, so we have a 2-stage secondary treatment, whereas Easterly and Westerly only have the 1 stage. Westerly utilizes what we call trickling filters. So kind of the same principle with the microorganisms treating the wastewater, just a different setup. And then Easterly sends their solids to us to process. So they do the wet side treatment, but the dry stuff they send to us for treatment.
So Brian, what else can you share about the Easterly and Westerly side of things with your experience that you bring to the table?
Well, Westerly has incinerations, the old style multi-hearth incinerators where they're taking care of their sludge. Easterly does not. Like Kelly had mentioned, they're right on the lake, so they don't have the secondary process that we do. So we have 2 aeration systems to do our process. So the secondary system, as like in the video where you see the denitrification process, where we're removing the phosphorus because we have to go to the river, protect the wildlife and the ecosystem on that side of it. So we're really good. We're very effective on how we do things here, process-wise. And the rest of the stuff for Easterly that sends it to us, we take it, process it, put it together with our solids, and burn it in our renewable energy facility. Now that in itself, we could spend hours on.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that too, because I want to get into kind of that wet side of the process and the dry side and allow each of you to share your insights. So we'll come back to that momentarily. Kelly, let's talk about, you mentioned the very front end of that video where Kelly Rojas was kind of going through the preliminary and the primary stages of treatment. Tell us a bit about that. The headworks that we saw is where a lot of the solid debris comes into the Southerly plant, and all 3 plants have a similar process where, as it relates to the headworks, getting the solid, large, bulky material out of the process early. Tell us a little bit more about why that's so important.
So as you mentioned, the first stage of the treatment process is what we call bar screens. So they're just giant screens that collect all the large rags, debris, sticks, big rocks, things of that nature. When we get high flow events like we did yesterday, we get a lot of bricks from the sewer system that come in. So those bar screens collect that material, dump them on a conveyor to be disposed of at landfill, which is really important for the treatment process because it protects our equipment downstream. We can't have that stuff going through pumps. There's the conveyor. So yeah, it protects our downstream equipment. And then in the grit tanks, we settle out the heavier material, the more sand, larger particulates, gravel, and that protects piping and a lot of those abrasive materials. We want to get that out of there. So that's what we call preliminary treatment, is getting all of those big materials, or not so flushable wipes, out of the waste stream so that we can treat it with the microorganisms further downstream. After those grit tanks, we have what we call primary treatment, is our primary settling tanks. And so that just slows the flow down a little bit further and gets the medium-sized particles to settle out. So what you're left with is more the biological pollutants that we send onto the aeration tanks, and those microorganisms, what's a pollutant to us is food to them. So they eat it up and treat the water.
Tell me a little bit more about that, those microorganisms, Kelly. And Brian, I think it'll be a good transition to you as well. What do those microorganisms do? You said that they consume the solid material that's left over. Tell us a little bit more about that, because it's definitely related to what we're going to hear from Cheryl later in today's broadcast.
So those microorganisms digest and consume all of the organic materials and nutrients in the wastewater stream. So as you saw in the video, Todd was talking about sludge. So what happens is in those aeration tanks, we provide air for the microorganisms. The pollutants, nutrients, organics in the wastewater stream are the food for those organisms. So they live, they reproduce, and that population gets larger and larger and larger. So that's why when he was showing the belts, how we remove some of the solids. So some of those microorganisms recycled back to the beginning of the process, and some of those microorganisms are wasted. And that happens after those aeration tanks. The wastewater is sent to settling tanks, and all those microorganisms settle to the bottom of the tank. So the material is removed from the bottom of the tank. You can see the suction pipes there in the video. Those actually move the sludge. We recycle some to the beginning of the tanks to repeat the process and keep that process going. The excess sludge, because that microorganism population is always growing and we have to keep it in check. So the waste organisms, what comprises the sludge, what we send for dewatering and incineration.
And the fact that we have living organisms that are part of the process, is that why we refer to it as biological treatment? There's different kinds of treatment depending on the facility. Ours are the biological process. Is that why it's called such?
Yes, that's the microorganisms make it the biological process. So we also have chemical treatment. We have a high rate treatment that utilizes ferric chloride and polymer to help things settle out faster. And that's when we have high flows. So that's a chemical process we use when we need to as well. We also use a chemical treatment process in disinfecting during recreation season. So from May through the end of October, recreational season, we have to control what we put out there to the environment. So we disinfect the water.
And we'll talk more about a little bit more about yesterday's events. If you're watching today live, if you're watching Tuesday's broadcast right now, you realize that we're following a day of significant rain here in the Cleveland area. And a lot of activity on our Twitter account was asking questions about where the water is going, where it's coming from, and what happens to the treatment, what happens to the sewers in conditions like this. Kelly speaks about high flow events, and yesterday was definitely a high flow event. So if you're watching this perhaps in an archive format, we're going to talk a bit about what happened yesterday, because it certainly has an impact on treatment plants. I don't want to miss that opportunity to hear from some of these experts about what goes on at a treatment plant when the flows are so significantly above average. So Brian, let me come over to you then for a few seconds as Kelly was transitioning to some of that sludge and solids handling aspect of things. Tell us a little bit more about what Todd was showing us there in those belts, and what that solid material is really, what makes up that solid material, and what happens to it after that clip of the belts bringing it down the line.
Well, you've got unique names when you deal with the wastewater. We got it RAS, mixed liquor. We call things cake. It's kind of unique, but those are actually the real trade names for them. Used all over the world. So the process is pretty good. So we take, like they said, we take the excess, we put polymer, and we take it, we thicken it up, where eventually it's going to go over into solids handling, which is the dry side of the plant. Kind of that's the transition point when the excess goes over. We put them in storage tanks, to let gravity help. And they thicken things up where then we'll go to another tank, get it ready for processing, where we have these kind of large, they look like centrifuges. They spin really fast where they separate things. They take more water out of the solids the best we can, and they go into another tank. As you see, the plant's quite large. And then they go on these huge things like, they're like concrete pumps. And then those will be pumped into the incineration where they'll be burned on that, which is kind of unique for the facility because the byproduct of that is heat. We generate steam. The steam turns a turbine. The turbine makes electricity, which then goes right back in the same building to try and minimize the cost of operations. So that's works out to that benefit. So as far as I know, Southerly is the first one of its kind that has the renewable energy facility that kind of uses cogen steam turbine to supplement the electricity that runs the facility itself to help take care of the solids.
And I think what's also important is that when you mentioned the renewable energy facility and what's taking place to keep the energy generated at that facility, the byproduct that's created, the ash, also has a reuse, doesn't it, Brian? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I believe they're working on that as a re-land application. There's an endeavor out there to look and go forth with that, reapplying it to the land as it goes out there. So they look at every part of the entire process. The team at the district is extremely knowledgeable. And always looking forward to the best way that we can deal with everything and the minimal impact that could possibly be put into the environment.
Yeah, we definitely want our impact to be positive across the board. And so our sustainability efforts, the renewable energy facility is just one of them. And we're continually looking for new opportunities to make those improvements and to be better with each passing day. Kelly, you spoke a little bit about the seasonal changes and how the process changes with the recreational season and how we phase out of that then at the end of the season. Why is that change in process necessary?
That change in process is necessary simply because, one, you have a lot more people using the Cuyahoga River and Lake Erie, so you want to make it safe for them. And then also in the warmer temperatures of summer, anything we put out like E. coli in the warmer weathers, it's going to reproduce a lot faster. So we want to limit what we put out there just to limit the population in the water. So, and it's generally a public health issue. We just want to protect people who use the river and the lake for swimming, fishing, boating, all those sorts of activities. We want to make it nice and safe for everybody.
So let me speak a little bit about yesterday's events. In the Cleveland area, on Monday, we had a significant amount of rain, well above average, and it came down fast. It came down heavy. More than 4 inches of rain came in over the morning hours in certain areas across our sewer district. And the treatment plant is at the forefront of receiving that flow. Can either of you, and maybe Kelly, since you were the last one to comment, let you pick up on this question then. How does the treatment plant respond to that kind of flow? How do the daily conditions that we saw in the video change in the wake of a storm like that? What's going on behind the scenes? How are people moving from place to place? How does the process keep moving in conditions like that?
So we have a number of tanks. When we were talking about the grit tanks, we have 7 of those. Typically in dry weather, we have one of those in service. It's enough to meet our needs. We have 7, one for redundancy in case we lose equipment or anything of that nature. But then also for wet weather, that increases our capacity of treatment for when we do get those large events. We also downstream the primary settling tanks. We have 18 primary settling tanks. Typically, we only keep 11 or 12 of those in service at any given time. The rest of those tanks, we keep dry. We use them for storage. We use them for flow through. That increases our capacity. So on a day-to-day basis, we usually treat around 125 million gallons. We can fully treat up to 420 million gallons a day. We can partially treat up to 1 billion gallons per day coming into this facility for partial treatment before we have to bypass full treatment. And that utilizes that high rate chemical treatment process that I discussed earlier.
So I want to share a couple of pictures. You were able to get me some images that may help to convey the reality of what's going on at the treatment plant in these conditions. So if I were to share a couple images here, what are we looking at right now, Kelly?
So this is our overflow chamber that goes to the environment. So when we get flows in that really exceed our full treatment capacity, we put it through partial treatment. It comes through the grit channels. It goes through those primary settling tanks. We do the high rate treatment. Then we have this weir structure at the effluent channel of our primary settling tanks. And to protect the downstream processes because of their limited capacity, so we don't flood out the rest of the plant, the water will overflow this weir and go through these two channels out into the Cuyahoga River. So this is what it would look like on a typical normal dry day. It's nice and dry, nothing going down there. And then I think, so this is from the back side of the weir. So that's what that back end of the channel normally looks like under dry flow. It's nice and low. We're not bypassing anything or in danger. And then I sent you a couple pictures.
Yep. And I will share those in a second. I think what I want to convey is a sense of, you mentioned kind of making sure that you're not flooding out later in the plant. This process is really about pacing the flow, because in a storm that we saw yesterday, those heavy downpour, sudden deluge events, that really has a capacity to overwhelm what a treatment plant can handle. And so stages like this help to slow that flow and be able to regulate it through the process. And so these are some more of the images that you sent me that really speak to how significant these events are.
Right. So like yesterday when our flows come up and we need to protect the plant from flooding, we'll put it through the first set of tanks. We'll put it through preliminary and primary treatment. And then this is what that channel does. When the channel comes up too high, it'll go over these weirs and you can see how full that structure is, that chamber, flow chamber B, how full that gets and how high before it goes out to the Cuyahoga River.
The other image that you sent me, I think, is really telling. And so I want to kind of have an animation to walk us through this. You sent us a graph. You sent me a graph of what the flow was coming into the plant prior to the storm event. And so I want to be able to try to show where we're at under normal conditions. So on the day leading up to September 7th's morning storm, this was the flow that was pretty standard, pretty typical on a dry day. Is that correct, Kelly?
Can you scale it down a little bit?
I can. What I want to be able to do is to kind of show the graph and show the process of it and the progress of it. So what happened over the course of the morning, as you can see here, things changed pretty quickly as we take them through the significant jump and the sudden surge that came through the treatment plant.
This is 2 days flows. You can see we started out, we were running around 60 MGD, million gallons per day coming into the plant with the dry weather. Nice weekend, so we didn't have a lot of usage. And then you can see when it started raining how fast that water can come into the plant. And you see how the influent kind of jumps around. That's when we're bringing tanks online and filling those tanks. It'll kind of, they call it hiding flow. It kind of makes it right. It makes it look like our influence going down, but it's just steadily climbing. We just are putting it into tanks at that point in time. So as you can see too, as you trail down, the rain stopped yesterday. Our flows are still really high. We're still at 267 right now coming into the plant.
Yeah, you can't see. It's right about at the midway point of the graph as of right now at the end of this, even as of this morning. And so this was just kind of meant to show how quickly things change and how a plant can respond and be able to manage the flow in a way that keeps the processes moving and maximizes the treatment capacity when conditions are harsh like this. Brian, let me ask you to speak a little bit about on the instrumentation side of things. What needs to change in a storm event that the operators and instrumentation techs are working on in a storm event that might not be the case in on a dry day?
Well, like Kelly said, a lot of the plant is sitting to handle normal flow. So you don't want everything in. And we prepare that on purpose so that when we do get inundated, like yesterday, 2 hours, this plant received 400 million gallons within 2 hours of an increase. That is pretty big. Kind of goes to the testament of operations here because they are very good at what they do. They know how to manage the flow. They watch the system. They know when things are coming. They'll put tanks in because it's a lot of water and you just can't fill a tank. It's not like filling a bathtub. Everything's got to go. And once they're full, there's your flow. It's already back. So the instruments respond and help them. And we make sure we maintain those instruments so that when the tank tops off is what they call it. And all of a sudden you have an extra 40 million gallons of flow induced back into the middle of the plant, that operations can see that and the pumps can respond. We have are in the center of the plant. They didn't show it in here. There's 6 key pumps that lift the water up from the middle of the plant to the high side. Those pumps pump, there's 6 of them. They're 100 million, 300 million gallon pumps, and then there's 325 million gallon pumps that move the water up. So those pumps are all automatic. We've been working on them. It's a brand new rebuilt station for the process for what they have. So that all works together with second stage once it's up there. Now the process is always going. So operations makes changes. They do things to make sure that the biological process is undisturbed and continues to treat the water. So whether we're taking 60 million or we're taking 400 million, we're giving full treatment to what we can do with the capacity of the system. Like Kelly said, when we max out the standard full treatment side of the plant, which is the high side, then the high rate treatment system kicks in. So they work all that when we have to do that overflow in the pictures that you showed. So that's where the high rate treatment kicks in, and we're still working on cleaning the water to a standard that we must obtain to. So with the disinfection system that's in place, we still have to clean the water, even at full capacity on that side of it.
And so if you are watching on YouTube right now, leave us a comment, ask your questions, and we will get back to you with some of those answers. If you're following on Twitter, you can tweet us at NEORSD using hashtag CleanWaterFest and join the conversation. Whether you're watching a rebroadcast or watching us live here, we appreciate that engagement. I want to be able to transition here to look at the lab side of things, but the last comment I want to reflect on, Brian, is just to put those numbers in perspective again. You said over a 2-hour window, the plant saw 400 million gallons of water come in.
Yes, it increased. Like we were averaging, right, like the trend showed, about 60, 70 million, and then within a 2-hour window, there's 470 coming in the front door of the plant through the bar screens, through the grit tanks, and then the plant they're already managing it. So as soon as it starts to increase, the plant is adjusting. It's a continuous process. There's a number of operators all throughout the plant. They're all work together. They're seamless on how they work together. They communicate and they adjust and monitor the flow.
And I think for a comparison, for those of you wondering how big is that number? If you were to look at all 3 of our treatment plants on an average day, we treat just under 200 million gallons of water across all 3 of our treatment plants on a given day. Yesterday in a 2-hour window, just our Southerly plant alone saw 400 million gallons. And each of our treatment plants was really pushing out max capacity to make sure that people were where they needed to be, processes were functioning properly to ensure we were able to continue treatment and keep operating properly for our permits and for the benefit of the environment. So I appreciate you sharing some of those insights and those numbers with us, Brian and Kelly as well. I'm going to ask you both to stay tuned in. We're going to transition to the lab side of our conversation today. We've taken you through Southerly, given you some insight about not just Southerly, but all of our treatment plants. But now we're going to transition to welcome you into our laboratory. The laboratory is really where a lot of the data is analyzed regarding the processes itself, and some of the work that Brian and Kelly spoke to. Our professionals in the lab are the ones who analyze those samples and make sure that we are functioning properly, make sure we are treating the water as needed throughout that process. And so I'm going to ask that you both stay tuned in here. I'm going to bring in our next feature video for today and make sure we have our sound ready to go this time. I appreciate your patience the first time around. Let's go into our second video, which is going to take you through the lab process. And so stay tuned.
Hello everyone, my name is Cheryl Soltis-Muth. I'm the manager of analytical services here at the district. Analytical services, that's the laboratory.
is Tom Broomhall. I'm a lab analyst here at the sewer district, and I'm working with some activated sludge here. We basically prepare a slide from some of the sludge, take a sample, and then we put it under the scope to see what's going on. We've got a rotifer. It's a kind of bug that's in the sludge that basically cleans the sludge. If you see the tiny little fingerling things on its face, basically that's what it uses to move and eat and to help consume some of the organics and bacteria. They're kind of eating the calories and the nutrients and the food that's in the wastewater. It's kind of like small helpers, and it makes it cleaner in the end process when it goes out to the lake. As it goes to the end of the plant, it's very clean and clear, and it's more of a pure water.
Our final product, the water that our treatment plants clean, we pump back into the environment. The wet test specifically can determine if the final product, the whole effluent that we pump back into the lake, has any toxic effects on living organisms or the environment. The adult fathead minnows lay eggs on the underside of these tiles. From there, we remove the tiles and place them in separate bins in order to keep track of the age of the fish. In this test, we use the young fry, less than 24 hours old, and we put them in concentrations of our effluent sample. We observe these organisms for anything, death, any abnormalities that could happen due to toxicity, and we record that over 7 days. That tells us if our effluent, our final product from our treatment plants, is a healthy water that can be dumped back in the lake without having any harmful effects on the environment or the organisms that live in our environment.
When people dump things down the drain, it goes into the treatment plants, and we need to see how much is in there because it interacts and interferes with the treatment process. So let's say we put a sample in here and we can tell that it's dirty. It goes through the system, we put it on, and then it comes out in a little aluminum pan. We weigh the pan, and that tells us how much oil and grease is in that sample. So this is an actual sample that we just had, and that's how we can tell what oil and grease is in our samples. And that's how we can tell what goes into our treatment plants.
I'm happy to be joined by Cheryl Soltis-Muth, who you saw featured in that video, and she is the manager of analytical services. So Cheryl is being brought into our panel, and she'll also join the conversation with Kelly and Brian for the second half of today's broadcast. Cheryl, can you turn on your camera for us, please? Cheryl, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, it's really nice to be here with you today. And I don't know about where you are, but the sun is shining in Berea today. That's where I'm calling from.
We are broadcasting from the spacious Clean Water Fest studios here at our headquarters. And so it's good to see the sun through our windows here as well. And yes. Again, I'm very fortunate to have you along here with Kelly and Brian for some conversation today. Cheryl, tell us a little bit about what your career path is and how you got to the role you have right now at the district.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to go back a little further than Kelly and Brian and tell you that back when I was in elementary school, I read a book on astronomy from cover to cover, and I was hooked on science at that point. Focused on science throughout school, high school, studied chemistry in college. And for the last 30 years, I've worked in a variety of environmental laboratories. The environment is also very important to me. The last 17 here at the sewer district.
So if you can, give us a little bit of insight about the lab that might not have been captured in the video. How many people work in the lab? How many different processes are part of a day's work in the laboratory?
Well, currently in the laboratory, we have 31 talented scientists supporting the work that we do. And in the laboratory, we actually have 5 main groups. We have our sample control group, which is responsible for receiving and maintaining all of the samples that we receive for analysis. We have an environmental health and safety and logistics group that's responsible for all of the materials, the supplies, the chemicals that we use in the group. We have a biology group that of course focuses on biology. We have a chemistry group that does a lot of the solids testing, physical testing, an advanced instrumentation group that uses a lot of the high-tech instruments that we use to test for the parameters that we have to. And then we also have an administrative reporting group as well. So those are the groups that are in the laboratory doing all the work.
I think it's a good summary. And going back to one of those first graphics we saw on screen was at 35,000. So what's that number represent? And really, can you put that into perspective for us?
I love numbers. Being a scientist, I love numbers. So 35,000 is actually the average number of samples we receive in any given year. And that actually equates to another big number, 180,000 individual tests that we perform. And we're testing things like nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen and metals and other chemicals. So that's what that number means.
And so what is a common workflow of a sample coming into the plant? Now, again, I know we're collecting a lot of different samples for different processes, but is there a common workflow that a sample will follow as it's working its way through the laboratory?
Yes, there absolutely is. We like consistency. So we receive the samples from, like you said, a variety of sources, including our plants. And it comes into our sample receiving, sample control area. There at the sample control, the samples are what we call logged into our laboratory information management system. We call it LIMS for short. We have a lot of acronyms.
Acronyms, yes.
And that they tag it, they store it, and they assign the tests that the individual samples need to have. So one sample coming in may need to be tested for phosphorus and ammonia and nitrate, nitrite, and chemical oxygen demand. So they manage all of that. They also maintain custody of the samples because it's very important that we maintain custody so that we know that the samples aren't tampered with or anything like that.
Yeah.
And they release the samples to the analysts in the lab, the chemists, the biologists, the analysts, and they then perform the tests. They perform the tests, they gather the data, and that data goes into our LIMS system, and it's QC'd and it's validated and it's checked and double checked, and then we release it to the data users. So our plants, our water quality industrial surveillance group, and even to our regulators like the Ohio EPA. We send the data to them.
And so you heard Kelly and Brian speak a little bit earlier about the biological process. They spoke about the microorganisms. So let me ask you a bit about the biology side of things that's happening in the lab and what the relationship is to the plant. We saw some of the footage of the fish tanks, and we should set up a live stream of that footage, because that's some very soothing, some soothing background music and footage if you want to have something running and just to keep you calm for the day.
Right.
But as it relates specifically to the treatment process, I want to speak about the microorganisms. What role do they play in the lab that was spoken to in some of the early part of the clip, and what's the relationship to what's going on at the treatment plant in terms of the role that the lab has in that work?
Right. And when you're talking about microorganisms, the first thing that comes to mind for me is we are talking about what I call some of our hardest workers that work for the sewer district. And those are those dozens of different microorganisms, whether they be rotifers or stalked ciliates or water bears or things like that. And when we look at the activated sludge, we will get a sample of an activated sludge from the plant, and we'll look at it under a microscope. And we'll be able to tell the age of the sludge. We'll be able to tell how the sludge is performing, if there are any issues with the sludge. and relay that information back to the plant so that they can optimize their processes to clean the water better. I think Kelly and both Brian referenced wasting the sludge and recirculating the sludge. Sometimes when a sludge gets too old, it isn't really eating the way it should, or getting rid of, I call it eating,
Sure.
We use those things all the time where we take our activities and relay it to the sludge and the processes, but they're eating all of the organic material. And sometimes when it gets older, it's really not interested in eating all that much. So they have to waste it, and then they have to bring on newer sludge. So by looking at it under a microscope, we're able to tell them, based on the organisms that are there, how the sludge is performing.
So Brian and Kelly, what can you add to that in terms of the relationship between the lab and the process side of things and operations? What role do you have in your roles working with the laboratory specifically?
Well, like Cheryl said, a lot of it's process control too. So not only does the lab test our effluent and what we put out for our permit for the EPA, it's also all the steps along the way so that we can check if we get a lab sample that's off, we can adjust our wasting of the sludge. We can adjust the timing of the tanks. We can adjust how many tanks we have in service to slow the flow down through the plant or to speed it up as needed. So that process control is a very important part of what we do and how we operate the plant.
Yeah, I'd have to say I agree. It's like the trifecta. We all work together. I work with the equipment to make sure that the samples are collected according to the guidelines that are set forth on how those are supposed to be collected. Certain samples are collected a certain way with a certain amount of flow. Others are collected because they don't require that. But we get all that stuff collected with the right stuff. We give it over to the lab. The lab gives the plant information back. Kelly goes to town and she makes those adjustments with operations to do it together. So one hand helps the other, and we all just work together on it. And the lab does, spectacular things with the information. They're working with all the facilities, and then some. It's not only the district that the lab is working with. They're working with a number of agencies out there for the skill set and what they do. So that's a huge benefit that we're part of that.
That's a good point. So Cheryl, can you speak to about some of the external work that we do? It's not just a matter of working with our own departments. We work with a lot of different departments on the environmental side of things. But we do actually have partners on the outside that rely on the services that we provide to ensure that the data that we are collecting for them is trustworthy.
Sure thing. And I want to thank you, Brian, very much for those very nice things that you said about the laboratory. I appreciate it. Yeah, we have great experts in the laboratory. These are professionals who know their work inside and out. And one of the things that we do provide, we have to do this testing for our own processes. And we want to kind of share the wealth a little bit. We have a utility assistance program where we do work for other local utilities to help them with the analyses that they need to do as well. A lot of smaller plants don't have a full laboratory like we have, that we're very fortunate to have. And so we can do that work for them because we have the capacity to do it, and we're doing it anyway. So we really like to do that.
So speaking of expertise, I want to come back to one of the things you said early on. I think it started to speak to the question I intended to ask, and so I wanted you to follow up on that. How many different scientific fields are covered in the work our lab does? You mentioned chemistry and biology, certainly. What are the fields that are represented in the lab that we have here at the district?
Well, I can actually think of about 8 different fields. You mentioned biology, chemistry, there's microbiology, there's biochemistry, there's also environmental sciences, life sciences, geologists. We have a geologist in the laboratory as well. That was their study, what they studied in college, earth sciences as well. So a full range of disciplines that are represented in the lab.
You mentioned there was a book on astronomy that got you interested. There's no astronomists in the lab as of right now?
No, and I actually have a cousin who's an astronomist, so I live vicariously through him. I was really set on staying in Cleveland. I love the Cleveland area. I didn't want to move and really to do astronomy. Well, you gotta have to, move to Hawaii or something.
Well, for all the kids watching, maybe you're in a class, maybe you're online at home, and you see someone talking about astronomy in the sewer district. You never know. There's always careers posted, and you want to pursue your interests. It may lead you into a scientific career you never expected. And so let me use that same question to go to Brian and Kelly for a little bit of their insight as well. If someone's interested in pursuing a career that you have now, kind of being in the thick of things and really providing a public service, Brian, what areas of study would you advocate for students who are in college looking to pursue a career similar to yours? What are maybe 3 fields you would recommend really focusing some effort into as they explore their career options?
Well, I'd have to say that the 3 fields they're kind of separated with the way the industry has changed. One is your electrical. You definitely go to electrical. The other field that is kind of blown up is the automation side, which is the middle. It's kind of like the binder, and then you have your instrumentation, which is its own independent field. All 3 fields are great. They interwork with one another in that field, and that's what we do here. Every facility, pretty much, if you're going to get into that kind of study, they all require that. They're going to require some form of an instrumentation. It's not like the instruments in the lab. They're just as technical, but very robust and industrial. Big equipment on that side of it. The electrical is the same way. It's huge. We've got like 13,000 volts that runs the facilities. At our facility, the other 2 facilities, they have 4,000 volts. So there's a whole electrical there. It's not just like house power. It's nothing like that. So those fields are there. They're available. There's classes in pretty much every school that I know of out there that can start them down that path. And then when they get so far, then they can either go into the trades or what have you. But definitely a good field to get into.
Kelly, what would you say? What would you recommend areas of study that might move someone in your direction?
Well, for operations, biology, chemistry, those are kind of givens. I was an environmental science major with a concentration in geology and hydrology. So that helps a lot with the open channel hydraulics, the settling of materials, how things move, that sort of idea. But also, I want to put a big focus on what helps us run the plant are the trades. So we have mechanics, we have, like Brian was saying, electricians, instrument guys, programmers. We have a machine shop that does amazing things. They fabricate parts, they do welding. So we have all kinds of trades too. It's not necessarily just a college thing. There are all kinds of interests and talents that make this place run. So we have engineers, everything. So it's a wide variety of skill sets.
Diverse faces, diverse skills, diverse talents, certainly diverse interests. And with the 4 faces who are on screen today, I'm fortunate to work on our social media and manage our social media accounts. And it's a place where I like to sit because it gives me a chance to tell some of these stories and convey a lot of the variety of work that is being discussed in today's broadcast, as well as the broadcast to come later this week. Brian and Cheryl and Kelly, I want to thank you for taking time for today's broadcast and giving us some of those insights about the plant and the lab. It's also going to set the stage for the broadcast to come. Wednesday's broadcast are going to focus on tunnels and trucks and tools that are being used in our system and the work that's going on underground primarily that you might never see. And a lot of the work on the surface that helps to put those underground systems into place. So that'll be our focus tomorrow. On Thursday, we're going to be back in the lab. Cheryl's team and our mad scientist duo of Adam Beaker and Pete Redish are going to be on screen and featured in our Thursday video, along with Jessica and Ebony from our outreach team. And on Friday, we're going to talk on the environmental side of things out in the community, where we are in the field. And a lot of that work with our water quality team and our swim team, our stormwater inspection and maintenance team. They have a great relationship with our lab. And so it'll be a good way to kind of have this information weave its way through an entire week's worth of broadcasts. Yesterday was all about the water cycle. So if you haven't seen yesterday's video, Go back to cleanwaterfest.com and check out yesterday's water cycle video. It helps to really make the connection between what processes we're talking about here today and how it relates to the information we're going to be sharing here in the days to come. So Kelly, Brian, and Cheryl, I want to thank you for joining us today. That's going to be wrapping up today's broadcast, and we look forward to you being with us for tomorrow's broadcast when we focus on that tunnels, trucks, and tours side of the fest, the Clean Water Fest this year. Coming to you live from our Clean Water Fest studios. We want to thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to tomorrow's broadcast, and we will see you then. Thank you very much. Brian, Kelly, Cheryl, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. It was a pleasure.